sort of key areas of focus in your new role for Vertex in coming years?
Yeah, I think, listen, my areas of focus are the same for the entire executive team, and I alluded to it in the opening remarks. We've got a business now that is very healthy, very growing, diversifying in many ways. Certainly, a lot of our focus in 2025 is on the launches, the launch of Alyftrek, the launch of Casgevy, the launch of Journavx. Sort of all attention on making sure that we are building momentum, that patients and physicians are having a great experience in the early days of these launches. And for those that are in pain, for example, ensuring that we are contracting and pricing in a way that is both responsibly balances access, but also preserving value for Vertex for the long term. So a lot of attention there. And then, as I mentioned, with 4 programs in phase 3, David and our colleagues in clinical and Reshma, our CEO, are very focused on making sure those are shepherded through the process. As I mentioned, we will achieve a number of milestones in those programs this year, some of which will produce data this year, others producing data next year. But that really does set us up for a whole nother wave of diversification, not in the distant future, but in the next couple of years, something that requires a lot of our attention these days.
Excellent, excellent. And how would you paint the picture of where you are with respect to garnering attractive insurance access for Journavx?
For Journavx, yeah. So keep in mind with Journavx, the approval was January 30th. So we're just over a month in, and I know people expect great things from us. We are moving as fast as we can. Honestly, we had as many sort of appropriate pre-approval conversations as we could have with IDNs and payers. Obviously, that's kicked into high gear since the approval. We are really encouraged by the conversations. So whether they are currently now conversations with physicians, with hospitals, with IDNs, with payers, with GPOs, there is very, very clearly an unmet need for an alternative to opioids, and Journavx fills that need very nicely. And there's a lot of interest in procuring coverage for this medicine. Now, that takes some time. We have said all along that going through P&T committees, going through the contracting process would take some time, and it will. But we've already seen signs of progress. There was some news in the press last week about ongoing conversations we have with Optum, not complete yet, but I think positive that these are occurring so rapidly. There are 2 states, New York and Arkansas, that have already provided coverage for Journavx. And so we have a lot to go, but the early signs are really encouraging. And I think in particular, some of the conversations that are going on right now indicate that coverage in many cases will be sooner rather than later. But again, we're going to balance that responsibly.
Excellent. And so, yeah, I think you actually understated the 2 states providing coverage. When I say that, my understanding is that it's fully open access, no prior authorizations, no step edits, which is quite extraordinary for states that are not in the best of financial health in particular, right? So New York and Arkansas were the ones that provided that access. Could you add a little more color?
Yeah, no, you're right about that. So obviously, our goal is to provide access for patients without any prior authorization or step edits. That is, in fact, what we've achieved in those 2 states. And again, I think it speaks to the compelling proposition, if you will, including the economic proposition for Journavx. These are states that understand the cost of the opioid epidemic, understand the role that an alternative to opioids can provide in this case. And so the fact that they've provided broad coverage quickly, I think, again, is very telling.
Excellent. Well, hopefully the rest of the states follow.
Hopefully. 48 to go. 49 maybe.
Excellent. So maybe we could just then pivot to thinking about how the inpatient setting is quite different from the outpatient setting. So clearly, broad access without constraints by PBMs is important, but also within IDNs, it's quite complicated. But how would you paint that picture?
Yeah, and I think we've talked about the fact that annually in the U.S. about 80 million people a year seek a prescription for moderate to severe acute pain. Importantly, about 60% of the prescriptions are written or influenced in an institutional setting, so in a hospital or a surgical center. Some of those prescriptions, the medicine is used in the institution. The majority, though, of the prescriptions, the medicine is filled at discharge or at retail and administered at home, essentially. So the largest part of the market is outside of the institution, but there is a lot of influence around the writing of prescriptions in the institutional setting. And so therefore, our commercial efforts in the early days are concentrated on a couple of thousand hospitals that ladder up into a couple hundred IDNs that represent the majority of prescription writing. Over time, we expect to reach the rest of the market, partly through efforts in our virtual or digital sales effort. We have kind of non-personal outreach to other aspects of the market, and that will grow over time. But the greatest commercial leverage for us in the early days is in the institutional setting, where the greatest volumes of prescriptions are written.
Got it. Okay. Excellent. Why don't we pivot to the pipeline a little bit? So it'd be helpful, David, for you to talk about VX-993, your vision for it, and just color and perspective on that first follow-on agent.
Sure. Let me start just with sort of, our long-term vision, and then I'll speak to the nearer term. We do believe that this is sort of JOURNAVX opening the door to what I think will, in the long run, prove to be a transformation of how pain is treated, because the selective sodium channels to block peripheral nerve signaling, getting the pain, basically the signals that take the pain from your tissues to your brain, has great potential ahead of us. And the reason for that is NaV1.8, JOURNAVX approved, and I'll come to 993 in a minute, but also there's NaV1.7, which is another sodium channel, selective sodium channel, that's expressed in the same neurons, that partners with NaV1.8, and that NaV1.7 triggers and NaV1.8 propagates the signals. And so there's really tremendous potential in the future for this. But in the near term, as we do with all of our programs, we continue to out-innovate ourselves. And with 993, I'd say there's three things that are particularly a focus with that molecule, which, as you know, is in phase 2, both in acute pain and also in DPN. And so the three things are, one, the ability to dose higher up the curve. So we don't know what will happen when we do that, because we've never done it before, so no one else has either. So we don't know if we're already at the ceiling or if there's more efficacy that can be had. But 993 has the potential to go higher, considerably higher, and the phase 2 studies will do that, so we'll be able to answer that question. The second thing is the potential for IV treatment, because just the physical properties are such that it can be formulated for IV, and we're in the clinic with that, which I think for the clinical in-hospital treatment, to be able to eliminate not only the oral opioids, but also potentially at least some uses of IV opioids would also be powerful. So we're working on that. And the third is the potential for combo therapy, which is why I sort of started by mentioning NaV1.7. NaV1.7, NaV1.8 obviously works as a monotherapy. NaV1.7 hasn't yet gone to the clinic, but the human genetics is that people who carry knockouts of both copies of NaV1.7 have something called congenital insensitivity to pain, which was first discovered in a family of Pakistani firewalkers who could walk on coals. They could feel the sharpness of the coal, they could feel the pressure of the coal, they could feel the temperature of the coal, and they were otherwise healthy. They just didn't feel any pain, and that's lacking NaV1.7. And we've cracked that as well, and although it's not in the clinic yet, we're moving forward aggressively on that. So the ability to be able to do combo therapy may be important in the future. Now, I want to be clear, JOURNAVX could be used in combo therapy. There's no reason it couldn't be, but our team in San Diego, who discovered the CF medicines and also is leading this pain program, knows a lot about how do you actually design molecules not just to work in a dish, but actually to work in combo therapy in a person. And so we continue to optimize so that the best chance, not just for the next quarter or two or even the next year or two, but the transformation of the disease in the future. And one thing I'll close with is, I first became part of Vertex when I joined the board in 2012, and Kalydeco had just been launched. And one of the reasons that I was so compelled, I think Jeff Leiden was so compelled by the company, was he became CEO that year, was because you had a target you had a disease in CF that, of course, had serious unmet need and no transformative therapy. You had human genetic target validation, in that case of CFTR, in this case of NaV1.7 and 1.8. You had a human cell model that you used. In the case of CF, it's HBEs. In the case of pain, we use human dorsal root ganglion cells. And then you had multiple mechanisms of action and multiple scaffolds that had already been proven their translatability. In the case of Kalydeco, that was proving you could translate the target and the cells to a human being. In the case of Journavx, now we've done that with pain. And so it's not like we're speculating we might have other molecules and scaffolds. It's not like we're speculating there might be another target and that they might work in combo like they did in CF. It's all reality. And so the question is just sort of, as we thought in 2012, how do you execute that? In that case, it took 7 years to get in 2012 to Trikafta. I'm not saying it'll happen that fast, but nonetheless, we did move quickly. And I think in this case, it feels just like 2012 to me.
Excellent. Yes,
Pain 2012, CF 20. Pain 2025, CF 2012, in case you wonder what I meant.
Excellent. And so then going back to NAV 1.7, could you tell us a little bit about how you've cracked the code there and what to watch going forward?
Yes. In terms of how we did it, I'll give some answers. Obviously, especially with the approval of Journavx, this is becoming, I'm sure, a more competitive area, so I'm not going to give any enabling comments. But what I'll say is that people have worked on NaV1.8 and NaV1.7 for 2 decades. And we're the first to ever get to phase 3, let alone approval. And the reason for that is selective sodium channel inhibition. There are 9 sodium channels in the human genome, and they have different functions. NaV1.1, for example, is the gene mutated in Dravet syndrome. If you have 50% less or 50% more, you have inherited epilepsy. So that's not a target you want to touch. NaV1.5 is involved in the heart, et cetera. And so it's been known from the human genetics that if you can modulate 1.8 or 1.7, you can have effects on pain without other effects. The question is, could you make a molecule that only did that? And finally, if you wanted, before we started, clinical evidence, it's not just Journavx, it's lidocaine, Novocaine. If everyone who's had dental work or had stitches knows that if you put lidocaine or Novocaine, which is a non-selective sodium channel blocker, you can block all pain. You say, why is that used locally and not systemically? It's because it blocks the other sodium channels. So in the case of NaV1.8, our New England Journal paper a couple of years ago showed 30,000-fold selectivity of 1.8 over the others, as well as having screened hundreds of other targets and seen nothing. With NaV1.7, the whole community was working for 20 years on a particular target approach. And we decided a number of years ago, technology had changed so much that people were sort of like following the thread that had been laid, decades earlier. And we said, there's so many new technologies, and we're not a platform company. We use all the technologies. So whether it's DNA encoded libraries, cryo-EM, AI, 10 years of structure-activity relationships, our in vivo, our human assays, and we decided to start again. So we said, let's pretend no one had ever done anything, and let's try and discover it afresh. And in fact, we did discover something new that's not in the literature that anyone else knows about that has now moved forward rapidly towards the clinic. It's not yet ready for the clinic, but I'm confident based on where we are that we'll get there. So it's actually something that's not knowable for others because we decided, let's start afresh with all the new technology rather than following something that was discovered with technology from 15, 20 years ago.
Excellent. That's very impressive. Thank you. So maybe we can pivot to CF. It seems to me that many CF patients would likely want to switch to Alyftrek, and obviously you're not providing targets. But could you talk a little bit about your connectivity to patients, both through your specialty pharmacies and Vertex Direct, and how you can pretty rapidly educate the existing users about Alyftrek's availability?
Sure, absolutely. And I would say the CF community is sort of among the most well-educated patient communities, I think, of any disease area. That's particularly true in the US, but increasingly so in countries outside the US. So whether you're talking about patients or the treating physicians, there's very little chance that they don't know about the availability of Alyftrek at this point. And we have said all along that Trikafta is a fantastic medicine. Many patients do extraordinarily well on Trikafta, but there is the opportunity to do better. And we think Alyftrek is the medicine that provides that next level of benefit for patients and a great profile all around, including once-a-day dosing, which obviously is convenient. We think that over time, the majority of CF patients who are currently on Trikafta or other medicines will switch to Alyftrek. We are not sort of actively driving switching because we think it's a very important choice for patients and their physicians to make, but we will support that as it occurs. And again, we do think the majority will switch over time. We're not that focused on how many per se make the switch in this calendar year, but we will be reporting out in our quarterly revenues. People will have a sense of Alyftrek revenues and therefore a sense of uptake.
Got it. And then could you comment on ex-US prospects for Alyftrek as well?
Yeah, again, I think that there's a significant opportunity. I think the experience with Trikafta has been one where we secured, I forget the number at this point, something like 50 reimbursement agreements in relatively short order, which I think shows the power of the profile of Trikafta. Again, Alyftrek with an even better profile we think is significant. We've recently received approvals. I think we just announced on Friday an approval for Alyftrek outside the US. So great momentum there. In terms of uptake, it will require reimbursement discussions. So the approval alone isn't enough. We'll have reimbursement discussions that'll be ongoing outside the US throughout the year.
Got it. And then maybe we could pivot back to the pipeline. David, if you could paint the picture for type 1 diabetes in terms of the opportunity as you see it, the data sets that we should be watching for, and also comment on the scalability of the manufacturing.
No, absolutely. And it's a super exciting program. I should say I trained as a diabetes physician and was a diabetes doctor at Mass General for a number of years before I focused entirely on science. And so one of the things I learned clinically a long time ago is there's no patient I've ever met with type 1 diabetes who doesn't consider the current state to be overwhelming life experience and not in a good way. And the reason for that is because you have to monitor your blood sugar like every minute of every day. You have to, in the old days, you have to inject yourself. Now you have a device that pumps and monitors. You have to think about every meal you eat and like what it's going to do. And probably the most concerning thing is that if you have any excess insulin, you can have hypoglycemia and pass away. And in fact, like I was talking to a young woman the other day who's in college, and her mother has like her monitor is tied to her mother's phone, so that if she has hypoglycemia, which she has, and doesn't wake up, her mother's phone at home rings and she calls the front desk of the dormitory and they send someone up to try and save her life. That's what it's like to have type 1 diabetes. So the idea that you could have a therapy that's a one-time therapy perhaps where you can be off insulin and have normal blood sugar is like a dream that people had. And what's remarkable is we bought Sema 5 years ago. Doug Melton, who was one of 14 university professors at Harvard, moved full-time to Vertex a few years ago because he was so excited about it. He spent 25 years developing this because his kids both have type 1 diabetes. The current data for VX-880, as you know, which is in pivotal development, is that approximately 3/4 of the patients who we described and will be updating at a clinical meeting this year at ADA were off insulin with normal blood sugars. They all had severe hypoglycemic events, and they hadn't had any since the treatment. The others all had substantial reductions in insulin use, although they weren't off insulin. And that led to the conversion of that phase 1/2 trial to a pivotal trial, which will have 50 people agreed to with the regulators, 50 people. We will complete dosing this year. And then the endpoint has changed from removing hypoglycemic episodes to actually being off insulin and blood sugar, then with elimination of hypoglycemic events as secondary. And that's remarkable sort of progress in the field. So in the program. So we really couldn't be more excited about that. Now you asked about what about how would that be scaled? And I think that it's obviously the case that manufacturing cell and gene therapies is no trivial thing, but we've been working on it for years. And there's sort of three ways that we work on it. The most near term, obviously, is we've just been working our manufacturing group to scale the current process, make it more efficient. And also we have a site in New Hampshire that's being developed, a factory basically, to build it with Lonza. In addition, and we already have an existing site, I should say, in Boston for manufacturing that already exists. And so we're building all that. But the other thing we're doing, which I think in the long run will have a lot of value, is Doug and the rest of the science team is actually going through and saying, can we fundamentally improve the process? So the sort of scaling of the existing process is the current focus for the launch of 880. But you can imagine by dissecting every aspect of this process, we believe we'll be able to substantially sort of make it more scalable, which will also, of course, be a competitive advantage if we've discovered things others don't know. And our goal, it's not going to happen, in a year or two, is to treat, 1 million people. There's 3 million people in the U.S. and Europe with type 1. I can't imagine one of them who, if it was, effective and safe enough, would choose to be, treated with insulin treatment if they could be cured.
Excellent. That's a great framework, and we'll look forward to the progress. So the next data readouts?
So we'll be describing data for VX-880. There'll be an update at ADA. And then we also have VX-264. One thing I didn't mention is that obviously I focused on the cells, and that in the last answer, because the cells are the key. If you can make islets off the shelf and you can manufacture them at scale, there's lots of ways to figure out how to deliver them to patients, but obviously a critical issue, since they're allogeneic, they're not the person's own cells, is how do you modulate the immune system? In the case of VX-880, it's traditional transplant immunosuppression. And the reason we did that was we wanted to limit the number of variables in the first clinical trial. That approach to immunosuppression had been used with cadaveric islets, so we knew that if we held that constant, we could see how our islets did, and they've done very well. But there's three ways we're working to improve that, because that certainly has some properties that you could improve upon. One is the device that is now called VX-264, where the cells are put inside of a device, and that device is then put inside of the patient. And the device was invented by our team, was at SEMA and now at Vertex, that are still all there, as the device has novel material, novel design to try and keep the cells healthy and alive, with the glucose going in, the insulin coming out, and not have the kind of responses others have had. But there are two other approaches in parallel. So that data, I should say, 264 will be reading out this year. We'll read out some data on that. That's in, as you know, in phase, the part B of the trial. The other thing I should say is there's two other approaches. One is hypoimmune gene editing. That's conceptually very appealing, and we're the only company that has a CRISPR medicine approved, so we're good at gene editing. But nonetheless, it's picking the targets you need to edit. And I think it's going to be a little bit more, I don't want to overpromise. I think anyone who claims you can knock out one thing, express one thing, and evade the entire immune system is oversimplifying the efficacy of the human immune system after 100 million years of evolution. But we're working on it, and we, in fact, are investing the time and money to discover those targets, not just sort of moving forward. And then finally, as you all know, immunomodulators are now a very hot area of development. So there's actually immunomodulators we might be able to use in place of the standard immunosuppression that might already exist. We don't have to invent them or develop them, and that's another way to try and improve the profile for patients. So, it's de-risked in terms of the cells. Obviously, a huge amount to do, and also there's multiple ways that we can get to modulate the immune system so even more patients can benefit.
Excellent, thank you. So why don't we pause for a minute? I just wanted to see if anybody from the audience has any questions.
We haven't said exactly.
So the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was, how big is the device for type 1 diabetes? We haven't said exactly, but it's of a scale that it could be straightforwardly put in patients, and they would, live a normal life.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, maybe we could pivot back to a few financial questions. So obviously you've described the fact that volumes are going to dramatically outpace revenue initially for Journavx. Could you just discuss that a little bit more and what we should expect you to comment on, with respect to painting that picture when you report quarterly results?
Yeah, I think it's fairly straightforward. So Journavx is included within our revenue guidance for the year, range of 11.75 to 12 billion. We have said that we expect the contribution to really show up in the second half of the year. The reason for that is that we don't have broad coverage right immediately after approval. So while we are working urgently to gain coverage, we would like patients and physicians to have access to the medicine, and we'd like them to have a seamless, clean experience. So we have financial assistance programs in place that will allow patients to access the medicine even ahead of payer coverage. That's why volumes will ramp ahead of revenues. As payers provide coverage for Journavx, those assistance programs will fall away. They're temporary. And as those fall away, then we'll achieve a kind of a more normalized gross to net revenue run rate in the second half of the year. And as I mentioned, we will, in our quarterly results, when the numbers are big enough, we will report out on Journavx revenues.
And what about payer coverage? So is that something you'll be able to speak to?
Yeah, I think in the early days of the launch, just so that folks have a sense of progress, we will provide data on prescriptions and we'll provide data on payer coverage.
Excellent. And then maybe looking beyond this year, and I know that you don't provide long-term financial guidance, how should we think about the company's margin prospects? So gross margin would seem to have some upward pressure given obviously what's happening with Alyftrek and that uptake, but also Casgevy drives some downward pressure, although very modest at this point. Could you just contextualize that for us?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is I think the strategy of the company lends itself to a really attractive financial profile, both top and bottom line. As we work to transform these disease areas with transformative therapies, that equates to tremendous value for patients, values for health systems, but also values for Vertex if we price responsibly. So each of our disease areas that we select, we think can provide significant top-line growth and attractive margins. In the shorter term, I think it's natural when you are in the early days of a launch of a product, there are fixed costs that you've put in place, either with a sales organization or manufacturing capacity, that have to get absorbed as volume grows. So to your point, if you look at the dynamics for 2025, the margin profile for Alyftrek is better than the margin profile for Trikafta because of lower royalties. So the amount of the benefit to Vertex will depend on the rate of Alyftrek growth and switching during the year. Offsetting that is margin pressure from Casgevy, which is very early in its launch, and from Journavx, which is very early in its launch. So we see a balancing, if you will, in 2025. Over time, we think each of these disease areas is going to carry attractive margins that are going to allow us to continue to grow and reinvest in the business.
Excellent. Well, we were out of time. Thank you so much both for being here with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.